This morning, as we continue our Resilient series with members of our congregation reflecting on God's resilient gifts in their lives, we hear from my own father, Lee Eilert, as he talks about his experience in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the faithfulness of those folks that were a part of his communities during that time and how that has shaped his faith moving into the future.
My beginnings of thinking about becoming a pastor was back in college at Valparaiso, and it really became formed in my mind and in my heart. My year after college, when I worked at a church, First Emmanuel Lutheran Church on the near west side of Chicago. I worked there as a youth worker for a year. And during that year is when I really decided that I would like to go to the seminary, and wound up going to Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. After that first year of seminary, I wound up hearing about a program called Student Interracial Ministry, where, and this was sponsored by the National Council of Churches, and they were placing white seminarians in black congregations, black seminarians in white congregations. I wound up going to St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Birmingham, Alabama, and spending a summer at that church, where I suddenly became much more aware of what was going on in our nation, and especially in the South, in terms of the civil rights movement that was beginning to stir. Dr. King was in the midst of that, obviously, the Southern Christian Leadership Council and so forth. My introduction, though, was showing up on a Sunday morning at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Birmingham, Alabama, and hearing that there was going to be a meeting of the Board of Elders, like the church council, after church, because they had gotten some threats of the church being bombed. And people did not take those as idle threats, because there had been several bombings of homes in the Birmingham area, primarily homes of black folk, lawyers, ministers. So it was serious. I kind of said to myself, what have I gotten myself into here? But the Board of Elders kind of set up a schedule where they were going to be staying at the church on the grounds and continuing from there. And that summer was a revealing summer, because I obviously started working with kids in that congregation as well, and went to one of the White Citizens Council's meeting, which was a step away from the Klan, but probably had many Klan members that were part of that, and just heard the raw racist language that was being expressed by this group, this organization, and people that supported them. I worked it along with a couple of other people that were friends of mine to get an internship back in Birmingham at the same church. So I spent the year then in Birmingham working at that particular church. In terms of faithfulness, for me, it was the faithfulness of the people at both churches. One of the kids I worked with, a kid at the time, only about 3 or 4 years younger than me, but a high school student named Jerry Downing. Jerry remained a member of the church in Chicago, eventually became president of the congregation, and was very involved for a lot of years. And Jerry had a snow cone stand And he set up shop in the summertime in the middle of this housing project. In Chicago, there were large housing projects of high-rise buildings. And he was in the midst of the high-rise buildings, about 4 or 5, I think. And that was kind of a playground. It was where a lot of people crossed paths, going and coming home and so forth. Jerry knew a lot about everything. And Jerry was the one who kind of kept me on the straight and narrow, because I really didn't know about city life and about inner city life, about gangs and so forth. And Jerry was very helpful in educating me. And a couple of times probably saved me from getting hurt, literally, because I was barking up the wrong tree and going the wrong way. I think of the faithfulness of Jerry and other members of that congregation. Faithfulness of the pastor, Don Becker, and his wife, Carolyn, who stayed there a lot of years. And this was the heart of the inner city of Chicago. And Don and Carolyn lived right across the street from the church. They really mentored me in many ways without being aware of that. The same holds true for the church in Birmingham. Joe Elwinger and his wife Joyce. The faithfulness of a family that I met in Birmingham when schools were beginning to become more integrated. And we were trying to talk to folks about sending children to a school that had been all white but now was opened up to black children. And I remember visiting with one family, not a member of the church, but just a family, and talking to them about sending their child to this white school. And they really, really struggled with that. It was, you could just see the pain in their faces as we conversed. And I wasn't doing a hard sell. That was not the purpose. My purpose was simply to say, here's the situation, here's what you could do with your child. And the father sat there and the mother sat there, and it didn't take them a whole lot of time before they said, sorry, but we can't do that. Because the father might lose his job. He was the sole income in that family. There were other children. The daughter might be exposed to danger at the school, after school, so forth. And they just couldn't take the risk. They decided they couldn't take the risk. I think that was faithfulness. Faithfulness because they were trying their very best to do their very best, given a very difficult situation. Looking out for the child, recognizing that things need to be changing in the schools. But they made their decision as faithfully as they could. One of the other faithful people in that congregation was a man named Chris McNair. Chris McNair was a photographer. He and his wife had a small daughter. He was a member of the Lutheran Church. She was a member of the Baptist Church, 16th Street Baptist Church. And their daughter was one of the children killed in the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. That meant some painful, painful days for the two of them, for all of their families, for the whole community. I think my preaching reflected a lot of the lessons learned, a lot of the experiences that I had in Birmingham and in Chicago. Not in the sense of pounding the pulpit and saying this is what you should do, or this is how you should act. This is not in that sense, but rather in the sense that here is what's happening. in our nation. Here is what's happening in our community. And in our community, we should be aware of that, and we should not ignore the racism that we see around us, that we encounter. It wasn't so much a matter of convincing people that they should not have these kinds of attitudes or feelings, because quite frankly, I think of my own family, I think of my own parents who grew up in 30 miles from St. Louis and had little, if any, exposure to minority communities. Before I went to Chicago, he said, "You realize that you may wind up in an alley with a knife in your back someday." That was his send-off. The intent was, I think, to try to scare me, but I think the intent was also just beware of what you're getting into and where you're going. Because of his experience, he had never had any dangerous encounters with black folk. But he knew that it was a rough part of East St. Louis that he was driving into when he was delivering that grain. And those are the ways that they influenced me. They also influenced me in the sense that when I finished seminary, I very much was committed to working in the city, working in the inner city, and was able to get a call in Syracuse, New York, which in the city where I worked as a part-time community organizer and part-time assistant pastor. From there, I went to Schenectady, New York, and once again worked in the city at a church that was located in the Hamilton Hill neighborhood. And from there to Dayton, and once again, an inner city church. But even coming to where we just moved from, St. Clairsville, Ohio, one of the interesting things was the impact that had on our kids, like on our son named Jonathan, who had experience having friends in the neighborhood in Dayton, black friends that he played with, that he knew, and so forth. Then he came to St. Clairsville, where there were many, many less black faces. A few black friends in high school, but I remember one incident where his friend was going to have a date with this girl who happened to be white. And this was his friend who was black. And that really prompted great angst and great anxiety in the family of the white girl. And she was just absolutely forbidden from from going out with this friend of Jonathan's. And Jonathan was in shock. He came home and he said, "Well, I know there are really prejudiced people here now," or something to that effect. I don't know if that's an exact quote. But it was a smaller community, but a long-standing black community. But once again, a very segregated community. You didn't get, if you were black, seldom would you ever move out of the place, the area called the Patch. I lived there for a lot of years, never heard that term. The Patch was the name given by white folk to that few block area where black families lived, where Jonathan's friend lived. Jonathan would go to his friend's house and spend time there, and Randall would come to our house, and then they'd be off getting in trouble somewhere. But we won't go into that. So that the community was, but some very faithful people, again, who did their very best to raise their families, to to steward wisely the gifts that they had, the businesses they owned. So in that sense, I guess just watching that happen has shaped me to a large degree over the years, and my wife as well. I think that in terms of stewardship, just the fact that First Emmanuel Lutheran Church, predominantly black congregation, still going strong in Chicago. St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Birmingham, black congregation, still growing strong in Birmingham. In fact, they built a new church. So that says they are stewards in the full sense of the word. Not only the money part, but they had to be good stewards financially, but good stewards in terms of ministry, in terms of their relationships with people. So that's the kind of stewardship that I guess I've seen over the years, and some of the places I've been, stewardship with the people in these places.